She thought it was just another school day. Same crowded halls, same whispers that followed her like shadows. But when the teacher called her name and handed her a violin, the room shifted. The smirk on his face said everything. This was an invitation. It was a test. A cruel one, because in his eyes, her silence meant ignorance. Her skin meant limitation. What he didn't know was that the sound she was about to create would expose every lie hidden beneath his smile. And when her bow touched the strings, no one in that room would ever look at her the same way again. But what happened after the music stopped? That's when the real story began. At 14, Amara Jennings had already learned how to disappear. A quiet girl in a new town. She moved through the crowded halls of Southridge Middle with her head down and her violin case clutched like armor. Bakersfield wasn't home yet. It was just another place to start over, another room where she'd have to prove she belonged. Her mother's words echoed every morning before school. Keep your head down, baby. Just learn. Don't stand out. Music was the only place she didn't have to hide. Late at night, when the world fell silent, her bow would glide across the strings. Notes soft enough not to wake her mom, but strong enough to remind her who she was. At school, though, she stayed quiet. The orchestra room wasn't just a classroom. It was a battlefield of unspoken hierarchies. The teacher's favorite sat up front, all smiles and shiny instruments, while the rest learned to fade into the background. That's where Amara lived, invisible, steady, unnoticed. Still, some noticed anyway. Her perfect posture, the calm way she tuned, the way her fingers moved like they already knew the next note before the page did. It was quiet excellence, and sometimes quiet makes people uncomfortable, especially those who mistake it for weakness. But Amara didn't know it yet. The moment that would test everything she'd been taught to hide was already on its way. Waiting in the same classroom she thought was safe. She thought silence would protect her. But silence was the very thing that would make her a target next. It started on a Monday, the kind of day that feels harmless until it isn't. The orchestra room buzzed with casual noise, the hum of tuning strings chatter, the soft squeak of sneakers on linoleum. Amara sat in the back, as always, her violin resting on her lap. Mr. Darnell paced the front of the room, sharp eyes scanning faces like he was searching for someone to blame for his own boredom. He had a way of speaking that made students shrink without realizing why. Every sentence dipped in condescension. That afternoon, his patience snapped for reasons no one understood. "Jennings," he said suddenly, his tone slicing through the chatter. Heads turned. "You've been quiet. Let's see what you've got." The words weren't an invitation. They were a dare. Amara felt every stare crawl up her back as she stood, her palms sweating against the neck of her violin. Darnell leaned on his desk, arms crossed, a smirk playing at his mouth. "Let's hear something," he said, voice dripping with mock encouragement. A few students giggled. Sense and performance wasn't really about music. It was about humiliation. Amara lifted the bow anyway. One note, then another. A melody rose, trembling at first, then blooming into something undeniable. The room changed. The air thickened. Even the laughter died mid-breath. What started as a trap was turning into revelation. When she finished, no one moved. Darnell's smirk had vanished, replaced by something darker, something bruised. But silence can be louder than applause, and Amara had just struck a chord he couldn't control. The next day, he tried to reclaim his authority, hiding cruelty behind professionalism. Solo rotations, he announced, pretending it was routine. But when his eyes locked on Amara again, everyone knew it was payback. She stood anyway, calm, collected, even as he muttered under his breath, "Let's see if lightning strikes twice." This time she didn't hold back. The music was sharper, faster, more daring, like fire turned into sound. When she stopped, the room didn't breathe. Darnell's jaw clenched. "Impressive," he said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Didn't think someone like you would have that kind of training." The words landed heavy. Someone like you? No one laughed this time. The class looked from him to her, realizing they'd just witnessed something uglier than competition. Amara sat down quietly, her heartbeat steady but her hands trembling. That night, she didn't sleep. The music that usually comforted her now felt like armor. she had to polish for battle. At school, whispers followed, some in awe, others sharp with resentment. Teacher's pet show-off, overreacting, the kind of words meant to erase what they couldn't understand. But beneath the gossip, something else was shifting. A few students started to speak up, to ask questions. Others just watched Darnell more carefully, noticing the way his jokes always tilted in one direction. Still, he acted like nothing had happened, like pretending made it less real. Until Friday. That day, he called her out again, but this time an audience. The entire orchestra, parents visiting for a practice showcase. He smiled too wide, gestured toward her. "Jennings, why don't you show us what you've been working on?" His tone was sweet, but his eyes said otherwise. Amara's pulse hammered, but she didn't hesitate. She walked to the front, lifted her bow, and began to play. The sound poured out, fierce, brilliant, uncontainable. It wasn't performance anymore. It was truth, and truth doesn't whisper. It demands to be heard. When she finished, the silence wasn't admiration. It was reckoning. Even the teacher couldn't hide behind his authority anymore. His expression faltered, pride cracking like glass. In that moment, everyone saw him for what he was. Not a mentor, but a man exposed by a child's grace. But the story didn't end there. Because sometimes when silence breaks, the backlash roars louder than ever. And what happened after that performance would test not just her talent, but her courage to stand in her own light, even when the room turned cold. The day of the showcase arrived like a storm that no one saw coming. The air in the auditorium was heavy with expectation, the kind that made even whispers sound too loud. Amara stood backstage, clutching her violin, feeling the weight of every stare she'd ever pretended not to notice. Mr. Darnell was out there too, front row, arms folded, expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken to her since that humiliating compliment weeks ago, but his silence carried the same poison as his words. When her name was called, she walked out under the lights, her shoes echoing against the stage floor like a countdown. The audience was a blur, faces blending into a wall of curiosity, judgment, and something else she couldn't name. She raised her violin, her grandmother's bow trembling for just a second before it found its place. The first note broke the air open. It was sharp, pure, defiant. Each sound felt like a confession, every phrase an unspoken truth. She played not just for herself, but for every moment someone had looked at her and seen less. Her music filled the hall. No sheet music, no safety net, just raw brilliance that no bias could contain. As the melody built, she felt something shift. The walls, the stairs, even time itself seemed to bend toward her. Then, halfway through, she caught a glimpse of Darnell. His smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow realization that his control was crumbling note by note. But what came next pierced deeper than any insult. When she finished, the applause didn't come right away. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and electric. Darnell stood, clapping slowly, too loudly, his voice carrying across the room. "Beautiful," he said, "especially for someone who doesn't exactly fit the part." The words hit like a blade hidden in velvet. The crowd froze. Parents shifted uncomfortably. Students stared at the floor. Amara felt her chest tighten. The sting of every stereotype condensed into a single moment. Her hands shook, not from fear but from fury held too long. She didn't cry. She didn't bow. She simply lifted her violin again and played one last, piercing note, a sound that didn't ask for permission or approval. It hung in the air like a challenge, like truth made visible. And for the first time, Darnell looked small, diminished by the very thing he tried to control. Cameras flashed. A teacher whispered. The tension cracked open, impossible to ignore now. Amara walked off stage without a word, her heart pounding like thunder against the quiet she left behind. She didn't know what the fallout would be, only that something irreversible had just happened. The lie had been exposed, and there was no going back. But as the murmurs grew behind her, voices questioning, defending, denying, one thought burned in her chest stronger than fear. Maybe, just maybe, this was a sound of change beginning. Because sometimes the loudest revolution doesn't start with words. It starts with a single note played without apology. And what that one note set in motion was far from over. The days after the showcase felt like walking through a storm that wouldn't end. Whispers spread faster than truth. Some called her brave. Others said she'd made it all about herself. The administration sent out polite emails about respect and sensitivity. But Amara knew those words were just wallpaper covering cracks too deep to fix. Mr. Darnell didn't return to class that week. When he did, he was quieter, deflated, pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. Students who once ignored Amara now looked at her differently. Not with pity, but with something closer to awe. The counselor, Miss Bright, stopped her in the hallway and said, "You reminded people what courage sounds like." And maybe that was true. But courage, Amara realized, wasn't glamorous. It was lonely. It was walking into rooms that once tried to shrink you and refusing to apologize for taking up space. The district opened an internal review, a phrase that sounded like progress but moved slower than justice ever should. Still, word of her performance leaked beyond the school. A local arts collective invited her to play at a youth concert downtown. The night of the show, she stood under softer lights this time, her mom in the crowd, her bow steady. When she played, the sound wasn't just music. It was memory, pain, and defiance woven together. Every note carried the weight of what had happened and the power of what could happen next. And when the final note faded, the applause came not from shock, but understanding. Later, as she sat on her balcony with her violin resting beside her, she thought about all the moments she'd stayed silent, all the times she let someone else define her. Never again, because what happened in that classroom wasn't just about her. It was about every student who's been underestimated because of the color of their skin, every person told to stay quiet when their truth made others uncomfortable. The system didn't need another headline. It needed change. And change, she knew, starts with a sound that refuses to fade. Amara didn't become famous. She didn't need to. She became something rarer. A reminder that brilliance can't be mocked into silence. That dignity isn't granted, it's claimed. And that sometimes the most powerful protest isn't shouted through a megaphone, but whispered through a violin until the world has no choice but to listen. So the next time someone is told they don't belong or that their voice doesn't matter, remember Amara and ask yourself this: how many more songs have we silenced before hearing the truth that's been playing right in front of us all along?